We Are the Medicine podcast is a healing space for the soul, where the focus is finding and activating the inner healer that lives within each of us. This podcast explores what it truly means to heal ourselves from the inside out. You'll learn practical mind-body tools to regulate your nervous system, release emotional pain, heal your inner child, and reconnect with your empowered, authentic self. Each episode invites you to journey beyond symptom management and into the emotional, energetic, and spiritual roots of health and vitality. If you're ready to remember your wholeness, to embody your truth, and to reclaim your emotional freedom, this is your space. You'll discover that the medicine you've been seeking is actually within you. I am your host, Dr. Liz Burkholder. My mission is to spark this inner healer within anyone who feels called to do this work. Join me on a journey to reconnect with our bodies, our hearts, and the healers within ourselves. You are the medicine. I am the medicine. We are the medicine. Welcome to episode 1 of We Are the Medicine. I'm Liz Burkholder, and this episode is all about what I call my first awakening. A lot of people have heard this story. I've told this story many times in many different places and spaces, but I want to record this for those who have not heard this story. So my first awakening, it's all about my childhood and childhood trauma and the first couple of decades of my life. So I was born in North Carolina, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. I grew up in Mississippi, where my mom is from. We moved to Mississippi when I was around 4 years old from North Carolina to move back to my mom's home state. And I grew up very poor in Mississippi on welfare and food stamps. Grew up in the trailer parks and the projects of Tupelo, Mississippi specifically. And grew up with mostly a single mother, except for the short times when my father was there and then when my stepfather was in our lives. So my childhood trauma consisted of father abandonment. My father left when I was 5 years old. And I vividly remember holding onto his leg and basically begging him not to go. He and my mom had been fighting, and I knew in my little 5-year-old brain and body, I just somehow knew that I would never see him again. And I didn't until later, decades later, when I started doing a lot of healing work and I went back to visit him when I was around 40 years old to tell him that I forgive him. At the time, he was in a nursing home and actually had Alzheimer's, but it was a very deeply healing experience for me and I believe for him. That's a story for another podcast episode. So my father left. That was one of the biggest wounds of my life. I later realized. And it's one that I've been healing on very deep levels over my whole life, but actually specifically the last 10 years probably, and then deeply, even more so over the last couple of years. So father abandonment, and then enter the second male figure in my life, my stepfather. And I experienced sexual abuse at the hands of my stepfather. So the second man that entered my life created a lot of harm. Another deep, deep wound for me, which created multiple other wounds. I lost my voice after sexual abuse, and it's been a journey my whole life to reclaim my voice, and I'm still, even on deeper levels, doing that. So I'm still reclaiming my voice all these years later, and actually this podcast is actually a representation of a deeper healing and reclamation of my voice and putting my voice out in the world to help others. So, and also grew up very poor. Like I mentioned, just grew up in a very deep energy of scarcity. And my mom had a lot of unhealed trauma herself and was quite literally in survival mode most of our lives growing up, taking care of 4 children by herself with nothing and no one, basically. By the time I got to be a teenager, I had lots of quote unquote issues. mental, emotional health issues. Things that we would label as diagnoses, such as anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, depression, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, PTSD. And going to school, being in a social environment created a lot of anxiety for me. Although I was smart intellectually, I socially and emotionally was very what I would call underdeveloped and stunted due to my trauma from being in survival mode all the time, right? In this hypervigilance mode that we learn to be in when we've experienced traumatic, chaotic, abusive, or neglectful environments. And I had a lot of issues as a teenager. I started getting into trouble. I started acting out. Whereas before, I was very, very internal, very withdrawn, very painfully shy. And again, I just would not speak. There would be days that would go by when I wouldn't speak to anyone at school and would just come home and speak to my family. So I had selective mutism, and I would mostly just speak around people that I knew, a handful of people, and otherwise did not speak for a long time. For years that went on, and would have panic attacks just at the thought of speaking in front of people. That's been quite a reclamation for me over my life, and something I've just even deeper over the last couple of years been diving into on a deeper level. So I got in trouble with the law. I ran away from home multiple times. I got involved in experimenting in drugs and alcohol, and I ended up dropping out of high school. I dropped out of high school in 10th grade. I had gotten arrested multiple times and was put on probation. One of my probation requirements was to go back to school. So I did for a little while, and then I didn't. So basically, breaking probation got me sent to a juvenile detention training center when I was 17. And basically, I was locked up in a juvenile delinquent military-based training school, boot camp type training school. I was locked up for 3 months. That experience quite literally saved my life. At the time, though, it was as a 17-year-old. To me, it felt like the worst thing that could ever happen to me, right? Getting taken away from my home, my place that I knew, my town, my family, my friends, taken away. It was like a 3 or 4 hour drive away from where I lived. And to be in this training school for 3 months, it was a big deal. Looking back, it was actually one of the best things that ever happened to me. And again, quite possibly saved my life. In that training school, I had nowhere to run anymore. So running has been kind of a survival mechanism of mine. I mean, I think we all have levels of all of the survival mechanisms of fight, flight, freeze, fawn at different maybe moments or times in our lives or different phases or periods of our lives. But generally, we'll have one or two that's kind of a primary for us. And the flight response, flee, run, has been very prominent for me in my life. So when I got arrested, I had nowhere to run. I couldn't run away. I couldn't go anywhere except for within myself. And so that was the beginnings of me learning to go within myself and started looking at what's happening. What am I feeling? Why am I here? What's happening with my life? Where do I want to go from here? Is this really the life that I want to live? Do I want to live like this forever? And the answer was no inside. But there was also a lot of uncertainty about how to get out of this place that I was in, this place internally, right? And which was showing up externally in my life. And I found this book while I was in the training school. It was called You Can't Afford the Luxury of a Negative Thought by Peter McWilliams. And this book was a divine intervention for me. It was sitting on a desk. We had school during the day. So back up for a moment. We would wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning. It was very like structured, discipline, which was actually good. That's the piece of the discipline and structure that was missing in my life, in my very chaotic life. Well, we would wake up at 4 a.m. and exercise, and then we would shower and we would get dressed in our camouflage uniforms. We would shine our combat boots, and then we would march in a platoon for a couple hours or however long that was. And then we would go to breakfast, lunch, and dinner throughout the day or in a cafeteria, main eating space, and then we would have school throughout the day, and then we'd march again and had evening activities. So it was very structured. And I found a book on the desk of one of the teachers and it struck me. It's like it just spoke to me and said, "Here, pick me up, read me." And this book was so profound for me at the time. And it was like a divine intervention. It was a divine intervention and it cracked me open. This book began to crack me open in ways that I had not experienced yet. The gist, well, I would remember having these aha moment after aha moment, and I just couldn't put this book down. I couldn't stop reading, and it was so good. And it talked about the gist of it was basically our thoughts. Our thoughts become things, our thoughts become our life, right? So it was our thoughts become our beliefs, and our beliefs become our actions in life and what we actually do or act out. And then our actions become our life, and our life becomes our basically our destiny. And so it was this amazing revelation for me that everything starts with my thoughts. And what are my thoughts? Let me pay attention. I started paying attention to my thoughts, and my thoughts were not kind or nice to myself at all. So I started realizing that, oh, these thoughts are horrible about myself. Things like, oh, I'm awful, I'm ugly, I'm a loser, I'll never be anything, I'll never amount to anything, I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable, people don't like me, I'm weird, I'm stupid, all these things. And what I remember is that the book would explain how we need to like shift our thinking, shift our thoughts, but also shift other things in our lives, but it really starts there. And just thinking back, I remember it talking about like guilt, and guilt will eat you alive, and these certain negative emotions will begin to wear on you as a human. So that book kind of opened up something and it began to shift things within myself and within my thinking patterns in my mind, how I now explain it looking back over my journey. That was the beginning of the mindset work, shifting the thoughts, shifting the mind, shifting what I'm believing about myself and the world, and noticing and looking at where my thoughts are coming from and why I believe these certain things. When I got out of training school, I read every book I could get my hands on, and that was my resource. That was the only thing that I had because again, we had no money, we were very poor. I didn't have a therapist. I just had no resources. So books were a gateway for me. I remember reading Dr. Wayne Dyer's books, one being Your Erroneous Zones, and was fascinated. I just remember being so fascinated by this man, Dr. Dyer, in this book. And it was just another opening for me. And I say that he was one of my first spiritual teachers because I listened to his cassette tapes. This was way back in the 90s. And I would listen to his cassette tapes, and his voice was very soothing for me and very calming for me. And there was just something about him and the way he spoke and his words that penetrated into my heart, into my being. And I know now, after doing many years of what we would call energy work, along with all these other things, I realized that I was receiving transmissions from him and from his energy and from his words through his cassettes and his voice, his actual physical voice, but also through his words and his voice in his writing, in his book. So I do truly believe that words are like writing, words, singing, vocalization, however it comes through is still a transmission. And I do believe very much so that that energy and transmission is in the book, is in the words that have been written. Some people argue that and say words don't change things. I would argue that. And I know for myself, his words and books and the other words of the books that I read changed me, began to shift my energy within. And obviously there has to be a receptivity there. We have to be open, right? To that, we have to believe that something can shift. So belief that there can be a shift is a really big precursor probably to allowing ourselves to shift and change by certain things and people and experiences. So, and then I found books by Dr. John Bradshaw on inner child healing. There was a couple of books I specifically remember reading, one called Creating Love by Dr. John Bradshaw, and Reclaiming and Championing Your Inner Child by Dr. John Bradshaw. And I remember just again engulfing these books and thinking, these are words for my experience. This explains my experience and being mesmerized by the work. And now I know too that that was kind of like a foreshadowing of the work that I would be doing later. Inner child healing is one of the big things that I do in the world, and one of the most, honestly, in my opinion, life-changing things that we can do from my 30 years of doing work, personal work, and my 2 decades of working with others as a helping healing provider or practitioner in the helping and healing fields. That was a foreshadowing of the work I would be doing in the world. And I kind of dabbled in it a little bit. Definitely not to the extent that I did with my second awakening, which I'll talk about in episode 2. But began the work of emotional healing and inner child healing, although it was very heavy on the mindset work. And again, we need all of these. It's inseparable, and I'll talk more about that as we go. So another thing that I remember specifically that helped me is this, I think it was like an infomercial or something that my mom and I were watching one night that came on. And it was this woman talking about anxiety and helping people heal their anxiety. And I didn't know that that's the thing, that's what that was called for me, right? Until I saw this, and she was talking about like all these people with all these symptoms and experiences of anxiety and anxiety disorder. And I was like, oh my God, that's what's going on with me. That's what's wrong with me. There's a name for it. So there was this sense of, oh, there's something, this is a thing, there's a diagnosis, this is a thing that people experience, and there's also help for it. So I'm not just this weird, crazy person that's experiencing this all alone in the world. Because when we're experiencing these things, especially as a young person, either a child or adolescent or teenager, or even young adult, we feel like we're all alone. It's only us. And actually, even well into adulthood, when we're experiencing difficult, painful things, we think we're the only one and we're all alone, which is why we need to actually get more vulnerable and talk about things and not wallow in it, but like talk about it. Right? Because we're all experiencing difficult things. So I saw this infomercial, and this woman, I found out her name was Lucinda Bassett with I'll never forget, the Midwest Center for Anxiety and Depression. And there was no internet back then. There was no internet. So Midwest Center for Anxiety and Depression, I was like, oh my God, this is like, what is this? And I remember telling my mom, I need to order this. I need to order this set. It was a whole set with cassette tapes. It had like 12 or 13 cassette tapes and a workbook to help you like work through your anxiety. And I think I remember it being like $300 or something, which for us, for back then, that was a lot of money. But for us especially, that was a lot of money. We were poor. So I remember saying, I need this. And I remember crying, saying, Mom, can we please get this? And somehow she made that happen, and she ordered that for me. And it was, it makes me want to cry right now to thinking about my mom. I'm just thinking about how she made that happen. And that was such a beautiful gift from her. And she's actually at the end of her life right now in hospice care and end of life care. So it's just really hitting my heart right now. So thank you for listening. My mom ordered this, and it was life-changing. It was life-changing. I would sit in my room and listen to these cassette tapes over and over. I would do the workbook. I worked the workbook as this like 17, 18-year-old. I was probably 18 at this point. As an 18-year-old, working the workbook and answering the questions of what are my beliefs? My negative beliefs are, I'm unworthy. I'm not enough. I'll never be anything. I'll never amount to anything. And literally remember writing these things out. And how can we shift this to a positive thought or a positive belief? And I would write out, I am learning. I will get an education. I will change my life, and things like that. And looking back, these are the things that I do with my clients and my patients now. Reflective writing, reflective journaling, and inner child healing, and processing emotions, and doing the mindset shifts and thought stopping. And it's really remarkable, actually, when I look back at this and my journey and how it's just been so divinely orchestrated and divinely perfect, actually. Yeah, so I began to have really big shifts after that. really, really big shifts. I stopped hanging out with the friends that I had been hanging out with. And really went into this period of just what I call going into the cocoon, and was with myself and began being with myself and looking within and really focusing on the inner workings and the inner landscape of me and who am I and what am I doing? Why am I doing these things? And how can I shift this? So I began to have a really big shift after that. It set me on this trajectory of just self-healing journey that has been the most miraculous and beautiful journey. And let's see, what did I do? I went back, I got a GED and enrolled in community college in my local town. And shout out to Itawamba Community College in Fulton, Mississippi. I ended up getting a computer programming degree, an associate's degree. And so I would work while going to school, and I would take night classes because remember, I still have a lot of social anxiety. And so for me, it was night classes were less intimidating for me. Anyway, I actually loved night classes, and I would work during the day and go to night school and started my computer programming courses, and I loved it and I was really good at it. And at the time, I thought I want to work with computers because I don't want to work with people because I had social anxiety and I didn't want to work with people. And I was like, oh, I'll just work with computers all day. I don't have to be social with computers. So I began working at this department store in Tupelo called McRae's. It would be equivalent to like Belk, if you know Belk or Macy's, something along those lines. So I began working at this department store, which is so funny that I ended up there because I was so, again, so shy and had such social anxiety that I didn't even like talking to people. So, but this job, there was something about it that was very intriguing for me and alluring for me. And part of me knew that I want to be able to speak easily to people. So somehow my soul took me in there and said, go do this. This will help you. This will help you come out of your social anxiety and start building connections for speaking to people and interacting with people. So this job, actually, I loved it. And at first I was like, oh, I hope nobody talks to me. I don't want anybody to talk to me. But as I did this job and was more and more in the retail space, public space, I began to love this job, and I began to love speaking to people and talking to people and helping people find what they needed and making suggestions for things. And it became a fun job, actually. Really, really started to bring me out of my shell more than I had been. And that's been an ongoing process throughout my life. But I loved it, and I accelerated in there and moved to different departments, and eventually went to work at a cell phone company and took a lead sales rep job and really loved it there, and just began this whole journey of working with the public. So little did I know that that would literally be what I would be doing. Again, it was another building and foreshadowing of my work in the world. A priming, a training ground. So this is what I tell people, like this, our lives are our training ground. Our lives are the training ground for our purpose and what we're supposed to be doing in life. Pay attention to what you're doing because it's a step, it's a necessary step in the process. It always is. So let's see. Okay, so then that degree, that associate's degree, actually took me years. It's a 2-year associate's degree, and it took me probably 4 or 5 years to get that degree, and it was well earned. And so I got this associate's degree in computer programming, and the funny thing is, by the time I finished the degree in computer programming, I realized, oh, I actually don't want to just work with computers. I actually want to work with people. So although that was beneficial, and I think any learning, I always tell people, like, any learning is beneficial. No learning is wasted. No learning is wasted. No education is wasted. You have learned and grown significantly through those experiences, whatever the learning was, whether it's an official formal learning or an informal, it's never a waste. So let's see, I got my computer programming degree, and then a few years after that, a couple years after that, I decided I wanted to be a nurse. And I think I finished that degree when I was about 24. And then by the time I was 27, I realized I want to go to nursing school and I want to become a nurse. It just was a really big pull on my spirit, on my heart, and enrolled in the community college. Same one, Itawamba Community College. Shout out to their nursing program. It's an amazing nursing program, and loved it. I fell in love with the nursing and excelled in it and did so well in it. And I loved the prerequisites like microbiology and the anatomy and physiology and learning about the body and how it works. And I loved it. It was fascinating to me. I loved nursing. I just did really well in it, was at the top of my class. And during the time, though, I was still partying really hard. I was still in really party girl mode for most of my 20s, but was learning along the way. I was growing continuously and was reading books still along the way, like all these self-help books and just all kinds of books, learning and expanding on these areas of life that I was interested in. Yeah, I became a nurse in 2006. I was just turning 30 when I graduated, and I was going through in my 20s, I was in a very tumultuous relationship, in and out, off and on, in this very tumultuous relationship, which was interesting looking back now because it was all necessary. Everything's necessary. And there was tremendous growth and learning for me in that relationship. And I learned a lot back then about, oh, this is all of my stuff playing out in this relationship. And I started realizing, oh, as I was reading all these books and learning about things and relationships and patterns and trauma, I realized, oh, I'm actually attracting unavailable men because my father was unavailable. And also there's a part of me that's unavailable and afraid of commitment. So I started realizing, oh, I have a fear of commitment. I have a fear of intimacy. I have a fear of trust. Like a trust issue with men. I didn't trust men, didn't trust anybody, but especially men. Men had hurt me, right? And I had learned men either abandon you or abuse you. This was the deep programming that I at the time didn't necessarily realize how deep that was, but I started beginning to uncover those things. And yeah, I began working on those things and eventually ended that relationship and moved out of Mississippi to Charlotte, North Carolina, right before my 30th birthday, and began a whole new life. There was a whole grieving process there, and grieving my old relationship, my old state, my old friends, my old way of being, and now moving into this new job, new career as a nurse, new state, having to meet new people. And it was a big grieving process there. And at the time, looking back now, it was so necessary. It's so necessary to grieve our old identities and our old lives and our old ways of being as we're moving into new transitions, into a new phase of life. But I thought I was dying. I thought, I'm dying. I'm depressed. This is horrible. And I would lay on my mom's couch and cry and say, nobody's ever going to love me. I'm never going to love anybody again. I'm never going to get married. I'm never going to have kids. When we go through a breakup, we think it's literally the end of the world and it's the end of love forever for us, right? I mean, and I didn't know at the time that that's a necessary grieving process that we have to do to move forward. We don't have to. We can repress it. We can repress, we can numb out, we can disconnect, we can dissociate, we can do all the things. And I did those things too. But a part of me knew I have to do this. A part of me was aware that this is a grieving process and we have to do this, even though my conscious mind at the time wasn't fully aware. So yeah, and then suddenly one day I was done grieving, and one day it was, I always say, like, the clouds parted and the sun shined down, and it was like, I can see clearly now, the rain is gone. That song played in my head, and it was like, oh, I'm starting a whole new life. This is exciting and this is amazing. I get to start completely over. I get to start fresh, like it's a fresh start with a new career and a new job. And suddenly it was like this amazing thing. Like, oh, the world is, there's so many possibilities here. So anyway, 9 months after I moved to Charlotte, I met who is now my ex-husband. But at the time, that was such a beautiful thing and a beautiful experience and exactly what I needed. And I also believe exactly what he needed at the time. And we were together for 13 years and had two beautiful, amazing children. And actually came to a completion in our relationship in 2021. But that's another episode, another podcast episode. So for the purposes of this, that was where I came from and the workings and kind of a experience through my first awakening. Second awakening happened in 2016, and I was a nurse practitioner at the time, and I'm gonna talk about that in episode 2. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. I hope you found this in some way inspiring for your own journey. Thank you.